Thank you very much for attending this webinar on the use of AI in helping with raw material risk assessments. In this presentation, we are going to look at how raw material risk is actually managed at the moment, what the problems might be with that, and suggest some improvements to that model which we've implemented in our software. So we'll culminate with a look at how we have implemented that and why it might be useful. This project that you're going to look at today is part of an Innovate UK funded project, which we implemented between 2020 and the end of 2022. And we are now in the process of rolling that out through our customers. So it's fairly new technology, and we're continually developing and improving on that as well. So let's jump into the points of the presentation here. So the agenda is, after a brief introduction to Primority, who we are, who I am, what we do, etc. We'll look at some key fundamental points that underlie the whole food safety management and risk management space. We'll then focus on the issues around raw material risks and the impacts of those on food industry, just briefly, and we'll discuss a little bit about AI and how we can use that for raw material risk assessments in the context of GFSI benchmark standards and so on. And then we'll look at a short practical use case demo of how that's implemented via our software, and then answer any questions you might have at the end. We'll try and keep the webinar to under 45 minutes and get through it as efficiently as possible. There will be a recording available for everyone who registered for the webinar later, and we can share that with you by email in the next couple of days once we have that produced. Okay, so a little bit about my background. Some of you on the call may already know me. I see some familiar names there. So I started my career out in the 1990s as a water treatment engineer, science graduate, and fairly quickly went into food hygiene, cleaning and disinfection in food factories, which led on to food safety and HACCP and so on. I then got involved in software development. I did a master's in software technology between 98 and 2000. And after a brief few years as a software development project manager, I then began writing and marketing HACCP software. So I've had quite a lot of experience over the years in dealing with lots of different situations regarding food safety management and systems, and really I've been in the whole software aspect since the beginning of that whole period. So later, I then went on to work for a quality management software company, and from there gained a lot of experience in the wider QMS type of scenarios in industry, not just in food, but in other manufacturing areas as well. 2016, I founded Primority, and the whole goal of Primority was to really build a fully integrated food safety management system to help technical managers and quality managers comply with industry requirements, legal requirements, and so on. 2019, we started looking at how we could integrate things like AI tools into our software. And really, that's what we've been focusing on for the last 3-4 years now, how we can leverage this amazing technology to make our jobs easier. So that's just a little bit about the background, but ultimately, I think anyone who's met me can understand that passion in life is to use digitization to try and make people's jobs easier over time. And it's a constant learning process on a daily basis about how we can do that. So these are some of the companies we work with. I think there's 1 or 2 of them might be on the call here today. Helios Ingredients, who are ingredients importer. EMEA Foods, big manufacturer of powder-based products, etc. Life Health Foods, formerly Pioneer Foods. Park Cakes, Weetabix, Iceland. I think you know quite a few of these brands on here. And we help them by providing software to make the whole supply chain and raw material risk management aspect more organized, digitized, and streamline those processes, save time, and automate quite a lot of things as well in the process. So the core problem that we founded the whole company on was this. The communication lines in any food company are typically very complex. They tend to be like two-way radio in terms of how things are communicated. Tends to be siloed, that the information is in documents and spreadsheets all over the place, And that is not a good investment from the point of view of risk management. It's not a good investment from the point of view of all of that data that's stuck in those silos that could be used to inform better decision making going forward. So what we try and do is we try and bring software to bear in the middle of that, sort of one connected system where we can connect up supply chain data to the factory, to the customer, to everyone in the organization who needs to be a part of an integrated approach to food safety. So our approach is really to look at the full range of functions which are required in a food safety management system, all the way from supplier and raw material approvals to traceability, quality, HACCP, internal audit, and the whole corrective action management process. And we believe that an integrated approach to this is really essential to an effective food safety management system. So we'll talk about that in the context of risk now. If you think about raw materials in particular, poorly managed risk in raw materials can affect almost anything in a food operation, all the way through from supply chain, food safety, food fraud, intentional adulteration, HACCP quality, general non-compliance, and also how the NCR and corrective actions process operates as well. Therefore, it's really important to understand where the raw material risks can be affecting things and the fact that it's a costly endeavour. If we get it wrong, then we've got all sorts of consequences which cost the business, whether it's safety, quality, product rejection, recall, rework, food waste. Raw material risk is really central to all of these things. And this is not an exhaustive list, but it has wide-ranging cost and safety implications to all businesses if it's not done properly. So the GFSI side of things has got a lot about raw material risk built into the standards, whether it's BRCGS or ISO 22000 or FSSC 22000, SQF, etc. They all have clauses and so on in there around supplier and raw material approvals, agreed raw material specifications, and risk assessment. And two parts which the standards themselves can be a little bit light on, and certainly we see that when we look at food companies in general and how they manage risk, is that it tends to stop with the risk assessment and a number coming out the other end, rather than being a lot more proactive and going into how to control those risks and how to monitor those risks. And that's really the challenge I think that software can help with, is that automation piece. And it's hard to do these things with an Excel spreadsheet, as we'll see. So there are lots of different ways of managing risk itself or measuring risk. You've got scientific methods, quantitative risk assessment, where you have literally got quite a lot of data and you're looking at the probabilities of things happening, and you've got a lot of historical data to be able to generate risk curves. And typically, these can be the most accurate mechanisms for managing risk, but data is the big issue, getting that volume of data and having it in a sensible, validated way. And that's why it's not used very much in the food industry, if at all. Another one is this event tree analysis, which I confess I don't really know that much about, but if looking at the diagram here, what you can see from it is that you've got certain events that happen, and if a cascade of events that happen, then the risk multiplies as that moves forward. So that kind of maps a little bit to the more standard risk matrix-based approach, which, if it's not used correctly, like 3x3 matrices, for example, similar to the one that's on the screen here, 3x3 matrices can introduce really quite big errors. If you get it wrong on both axes, you've got a really big difference in the outcome of the risk measurement piece. So these are a lot more qualitative and they are easier to use, which is why the food industry kind of defaults to that. They're more accessible. But there are other ways of measuring risk as well, indicators, other types of assessments that you can do, which can scoring and weighting and so on. But the goal here to have risk management adopted properly is to have an accessible, easy to use risk approach in order to be able to measure risk and then manage it properly. Another one that you may or may not have heard of is bow tie analysis. This is heavily used in the oil industry for the whole prevention and recovery of things that can go wrong. And actually, it's very like HACCP, because on the left-hand side, you've got threats, potential causes of those threats. So that's kind of like your hazard and potential cause. You've got ways of controlling those hazards. You've got hazardous event itself. And then you've got recovery measures and potential outcomes. So a slight departing from the HACCP model on this side, on the recovery side, because we would call that the corrective action side of things. And typically we'll be measuring consequences in the risk assessment aspect of the hazardous event. So hopefully that gives you just a little bit of background to other ways of managing risk. And I'm going to look at alternatives to this in our software as well. So the 4 problems with risk management. 1, there are too many sources of risk information from the supplier, from the supply chain, from horizon scanning tools, and so on. The second one is that there's not enough time available to gather, analyze, and manage information. Third big problem is a lot of these, how risk is managed in terms of assessment, is spreadsheet based, which can quickly become out of date. They don't have a lot of automation in there apart from formulas and so on. And then the fourth one is keeping risks up to date. So what's actually happening out there? Risks do not stand still. They change over time. New ones emerge and new patterns emerge and so on as well. So these, for me, are the big problems that we see that, frankly, a software platform can help with. So to manage risk effectively and efficiently, these are the kinds of problems that need to be solved. So I mentioned too many data sources, and it's great that these data sources are out there. However, they all talk about food safety incidents and risks and hazards and everything in different ways. And the data is structured in different ways as well. So just to get data, you actually require a lot of time and big budgets, and most food companies just don't go there with that. This again is where we feel that AI can be used to read from these data sources, and we'll talk about that a bit later, and pull that information into a model that makes sense for your business. So the result of these problems is that there's a lot of huge out-of-date risk spreadsheets in quite a lot of food businesses out there, and they can become a risk in themselves because they're just not accurate enough and they're not up to date enough. They can't automate renewals, and that for me is the big problem on how we can transform raw material risk management. Because if you want to get it automated, if you want to take advantage of data, then you need something that's a bit more sophisticated than an Excel spreadsheet. So what do I mean by that then? So the way that we approached this was to look at all the different data sources out there that have information on food safety incidents, risks, and so on, and to take that information and add it into the HACCP, VACCP, and CACCP, and also the raw material risk assessment. And we feel that bringing all of these things together gives us a much more informed, better food safety management system. Again, I'm going to show you some of that in practice a little bit later. But first, let's talk about AI for a moment. AI is very topical right now. It's been all over the news in the last month or so. ChatGPT and different AI models that are out there, and the US and the UK are going to regulate it all and all of that sort of stuff. Our experience of AI is using AI to gather information efficiently and use it for a specific purpose, and make sure there's a human being who is curating that, because the AI that's there is not 100% accurate, can be biased. Therefore, we need a human gatekeeper at the end of that process to decide whether they're going to use that information or not. And that's really a key learning that we've done along the way about how we can use AI to inform risk and food safety management, etc. So artificial intelligence is nothing more than a computer program with the ability to learn and reason like humans. Machine learning is a tool within artificial intelligence to look at lots of data and make judgment calls or assumptions or create answers from that. And deep learning is where you've got a large artificial neural network of data with connections in between all of that. And the fact that we've got a computer program that can do this learning, this deep learning on this data, means that we can extract from it useful information without having to go and do all the research ourselves. So AI can help with that whole time and resource problem. By training AI to perform certain tasks, we can get the information back that we need and then we can be the judge as to whether that is useful information or not. And that's the approach that we've taken with it. So some of the problems that AI is good at solving, it's good at recognizing things like supplier names, raw material names, identifying food safety hazards. These are all pretty straightforward problems to solve, but it's making sense of it all at the end, identifying food fraud keywords, spotting unusual trends, and all of this can be used to generate early warning alerts. There are tools out there which will use predictive analysis. How good they are remains to be seen. Everyone would love to be able to predict the future to reduce their risk, but it's a kind of a holy grail question right now, and I don't think anyone's really there with it just yet, but I think it will come. The big benefit of AI is that it works at hyper speed, 24/7, no holidays, no sickness, and it's performance enhancing. But it doesn't replace people who are managing risk. For us anyway, it's about making suggestions about what else you might want to consider. So how does it work? For us, it works by we listen to and gather information from data sources, and we can build these data source listeners for just about any data source. If it's available online, we can go get that data. If it's got what's connection into the data via an API into the database, we can go get that data. And then we use AI to make sense of it, because the data is all described in different ways. So we build AI models to recognize supplier names, hazard names, et cetera, and company names and so on. So that all comes into this stage here where we can identify specific hazards, companies, and categories of products. We can then use that in our risk models to assess impact, and we can make those models configurable, and then we can take and record corrective action and what other monitoring that we're going to do. And all of this then feeds into the raw material risk assessment, which we're focusing on today: CASUP, VASUP, and TASUP, food fraud and intentional adulteration. So we're not going to look at these today. We're going to have another webinar to focus in on that, probably in around a month's time. So at this point, I'm going to stop the PowerPoint and over to the software itself and take you through that. There's a bunch of other slides on here which you can get a copy of later to give you an aide-memoire to some of this stuff. So this is on our software platform. I won't be going into everything in here, but suffice to say that our solution is modular, which means that depending on your role within any food business, you can have modules switched on and off to help you do, whether it's supplier management, whether it's audits or corrective actions or HACCP or traceability or whatever it happens to be. But we're going to be spending a bit of time in here in the material module. So the material module in 3iVerify, it's a fairly new module. There will be some customers on today on this call who are going to be interested in how this works. But essentially, we've got a master list of materials, raw materials in the system. And we also have a master risk assessment of all of those materials by supplier and or manufacturer. Right, so what are we looking at here? So these are a list of all of the materials which we have against this particular site. So this might be a list of different factories up here, and these are all the materials that are being supplied to that particular factory. Underneath this is what we call a risk grid, and in here we are looking at a manufacturer risk assessment here. We're looking at an allergen MAQ, so this one is designed to come from the material assessment questionnaire, which goes to the supplier. And in fact, all of these risk assessments can be embedded in a questionnaire that gets sent to suppliers. So this one's a particular type of allergen assessment. We'll look at that in a moment. These other boxes here for allergen, chemical, micro, physical, radiological, and intentional adulteration are risk matrix based. Again, we'll look at those in a second. And then we've got a food fraud one here. So the concept is that each risk assessment that takes place, and you can do these at any time for any reason during a routine review, or maybe because we're seeing a high level of NCRs coming from a particular supplier, you might want to reassess at that point. And what happens is the scores which come out from each of the risk assessments then is weighted and summed up in this total score, which determines what kind of management action that we're going to take around control and mitigation of those risks. So to highlight this, what I'm going to do is just do a few of these risk assessments so you can see how this works. I'm just going to do a risk assessment here. This particular one is a criteria-based risk assessment. So in other words, we're going to ask a set of questions with criteria against each of the questions or the areas of assessment. And when we do that, a score is going to come out of each of the criteria selected. So I'm just going to do a new assessment here so you can see how this works. So there isn't any particular AI at this point, but when we get to the next stages of the risk assessment, you'll see that. So in here, we've got some configurable criteria. This will be different for each business, and you can set out what your area of assessment is, and then we can run through, answer the questions. The system is going to score it. So the structure of how you set up your questions and your criteria is obviously quite important, because that determines the score, and it gives us a standardized way of measuring risk against a particular manufacturer in this case. So what we do have is got a scoring scheme up here, again, which you can set to be what you need. In this case, if it's less than 20, they're low risk, 20 to 29, they're medium risk, more than 29, they're high risk. So in this case, we've got a 34. This one is going to be high risk. And we can put in justification here, last year, whatever, and then you can upload evidence of that recall into the risk assessment as well. So the risk assessment is designed to be two-stage risk assessment with an assessor and an approver. So the assessor is the person who would do the initial risk assessment, gather the information, allow the system to score things, and then come along and they would then put in their password to process that risk assessment so it goes for approval to someone else on the team. Now, in smaller businesses, or in, not just in smaller businesses, it might be the same person. So you can have a role as I have in this case, of an assessor and an approver if you need that. So the general idea is that the approver will get an email, they'll come along and review the risk assessment that they need to check out. They can then come here and put in their comments or any questions or whatever. They don't need to approve it. They can set it rejected, for example. So they can come down here now and do approve reject here. And you can see this is where you can say, I'm rejecting this because I needed to go do something else. I'm going to save it as a draft and look at it later, or I'm just going to approve it. And again, put the password in and process. So bear in mind, this is about the manufacturer in this particular case, not the raw material. That's now completed, it's locked out. This will then update the overall grid score and, of course, the management aspect in there as well. It's printable. There's a history here. So every risk assessment that's ever been done is here. Again, this is quite difficult to do with an Excel spreadsheet to keep this level of detail and to have documented, printable risk assessments that are user-friendly and that can be sent and shared to other people in the team, other people in the company. Having that history there is extremely useful. And over time, what we'll be able to do then is look at how risk is changing with particular manufacturers, maybe in particular countries, and so on. So it's gathering digitized data that is going to give us useful information for trending and alerting and analytics and so on down the line. That's a manufacturer risk assessment. Just to show you how that's set up so that you can understand that this is really pretty straightforward to set up. I'm just going to go into our admin area here. And in the admin area, we've got this risk assessment module. And within that is where we can set up all of the configuration of the supplier risk assessment, manufacturer risk assessment, the risk matrices, risk categories. So there's a whole range of tools in here, which I won't go into massive detail right now, but these two here are for that supplier risk setup. So here's where I set up my scoring. Here's where I set up my criteria. You don't need to use what we're giving you out of the box. You can adapt this to whatever your needs are. So here's that first question. These are the criteria, and here's the scoring, and so on. Sort out your own color codes, everything that you need to do in order to configure that particular risk assessment here. So that's the manufacturer risk assessment. Let's look at the allergen risk assessment part. So again, in this case, this one's already been done. And I'd like to show you a new one here. We developed this with a few of our customers, actually, by trying to look at how could we do allergen risk assessments in an MAQ more effectively. And what we came up with was, again, a scored approach. And in this case, we've got each of the allergens in the list here. And then we've got a risk status list. And again, this is configurable. So you might say, for example, celery is not present in the product raw materials or on site. So that gets a risk score of 1, a low score being a good thing. Maybe that the product is the allergen. So you might do that one. So that's a 2. So it's, the product is the allergen, so that the risk score is low. But again, if you wanted to change that, you can. It may be that may be contained due to the nature of the manufacturing facility and so on. So this approach here will add up all of these scores and output a risk number at the bottom based on what we are answering here. And again, this can be done directly in the material assessment questionnaire in order to touch that data once, get it into the system, and then get your updates and alerts as to when things need to change. Again, it would be a case of an approver. Any evidence you want to upload about that, you can do that. Copy of the label, product spec, whatever it happens to be. That can all go in there as well. And then once that's done, the approver can come along and again approve it or save it as a draft or whatever. And again, you're going to get that history, you're going to get that printout. Over time, you'll be able to see what the history is of allergen risk for a particular product and so on. And again, it's all printable. Okay, so that is a little bit on allergen. Again, that would feed into the overall risk score here. Your number changed there by 1 or something. This is another way of doing allergens, more traditional way maybe. And this is where we are using a risk matrix. Again, this risk matrix is configurable in that admin area. And underneath that, you'll see there's a bunch of allergen risks which have been already identified here. There's quite a long list on this one. I want to do a new risk assessment. There's a couple of things I just want to point out here. So we've got the risk matrix here. Notice it's not a 3x3. This one's actually a 4x4, which is the minimum that we would recommend in terms of accuracy. In fact, we would always recommend to go with a 5x5 matrix to get even better granularity on risk and how you're going to be managing it. This particular one is, you can see the risk matrix here, and we will run through the assessment part and comes out with a score. But we go a stage further here, in that we are then identifying, well, what's the control measure? And it's the allergen control program in this case. Actually, all of this data here is coming from the back-end AI side of things. And then we've got, where is it controlled? Is it us? Is it the supplier? Is it the consumer? How is that risk controlled? And this is the way that a lot of the risk assessments are now going, driven by the FDA and the whole Food Safety Modernization Act. And we need to now be looking at the entire supply chain from a risk perspective. And that's why we've included this here, because I think a lot of companies do the risk assessment and they come out with a number and they don't really talk about how they're going to control it in any great detail and where it's controlled and so on. I'm generalizing, so I'm not here to offend anyone in terms of how they're doing things. The key point being that if I were to add a new hazard of risk into this, it might be suggested to me by AI, for example. So this is my existing list. And down here, it might come out that they've got a new production area next door and the air conditioning system is joined or something, and therefore might be due to airflow or something there. Or it might be in the produce industry, growth and harvest proximity to other known allergen crops, for example. Again, these are things that we might not necessarily think about, but all of this data is coming from our AI-generated neural network map. And therefore, we can find risks and hazards in here which we wouldn't necessarily think of. What you want isn't there. You can add to that, and that will add it into that neural network map. So you can pick out your own combination, and that will make connections between data points and so on in there. I won't bother doing that one right now. But the point is that we can use this generated data to add new risks, and we will be looking to automate that going forward so that we can make suggestions on these raw material risks. We're already doing that in our HACCP, VACCP and TACCP module, and we're going to be doing that in here next. So again, I won't run through that one fully, but I think you get the idea. It's risk matrix based. We're using AI to populate that information, but we've got full control over what we use, and we also have full control of what we put into the system. So it's not intrusive and it doesn't take over the show. So allergens, chemicals, micro, physical, they're all fairly similar, but they've got different risk matrices. And I want to talk about scope for a moment. Whenever we're doing risk assessments, especially if you've got hundreds of different raw materials from hundreds of suppliers, then it's sometimes just not feasible to do risk assessments on each individual material supplier combination. It just becomes a nightmare very quickly. So one of the things, and again, from feedback from customers, we introduced was the concept of scoping risk assessment. A good example of that might be the use of pesticides in cereals, for example, or in fresh produce that's grown or whatever. So generally speaking, what you could do is a chemical risk assessment on a particular category of product or a particular risk category of product, and scope this risk assessment so that when you do the risk assessment for this product, which happens to be one of 20 products in that particular risk category, then this risk assessment can be applied to all of them. Now, yes, that saves a lot of time, but also gives you a standardized approach for all of the raw materials in that particular risk category. So again, this one has its own risk matrix. You'll see one of the latest BRCGS requirements is to have and define what is a significant risk. So in this case, this is all defined in the setup of this risk matrix, that a significant risk is one that is less than or equal to 20 in that particular case. And again, you can set out what your scoring systems are. Down here also, again, if we were to do a new assessment here from that point of view, we could add new hazards in, but we can't do that at the moment because this one's already been passed through for approval. So I'll just do that one. What that will do is it will apply that risk assessment to all other materials that are of that same category, because this particular one we have set as a scoped risk assessment. You'll see here it applies to all materials of the same risk status, ignoring the supplier and the manufacturer. So there's lots of different ways you can do this that make it really easy and efficient to be able to do these risk assessments. Further on from this, again, most of these are risk matrix driven with their own settings and so on. And then we also have a food fraud risk assessment here as well. This one's not so much AI, it's more criteria based and scoring based. But again, we do plan to enhance that with AI down the line here as we incorporate more tools that help rather than hinder and so on. So you can see a score comes here, there's a scoring system there and so on as well. And ultimately, this information can feed through into the HACCP process. It could feed through into finished product specs. There's all sorts of permutations that we can do with this as we develop that digitized risk data. So I think that's probably a good place to stop for some Q&A. Key goal of today was to really get people thinking about how you manage raw material risks, look at what tools are available, certainly for some of our customers that are on this call, to get a bit more up to speed on the new risk module and to try get some feedback from you as well about what you think of the tools and answer any of your questions. So I've got Sue, our technical director, on the call as well. I think, Sue, have you been monitoring for any questions? If you do have questions, put them in the chat box there. But have you got any questions or something you can kick us off with, Sue?
I have. Thank you, James, and thank you for the informative and thought-provoking look at risk assessment. One question I have is, how is the use of AI controlled, and is it constantly refreshing or updating the system knowledge base?
Yeah, I mean, from our perspective, the use of AI, there's really two aspects to it. One is AI jobs, we call them, that we've built in-house that fulfill a very specific function, like going and reading an FDA data source or a RASIF data source, and then identifying what is the content of that information. So is it a food safety hazard? Is it a recall? Does it affect a particular company? And these kinds of things. And then we feed that into various aspects of the system. So from the point of view of the AI models that we've built, those are all really tightly controlled and they fulfill only a very specific function. In fact, we've probably got about a dozen small AI jobs, little micro AI jobs that go and do various things in order to pull that data together. But none of those talk to each other, kind of thing. So I guess that's one way that it's kind of controlled. The other aspect of AI we're now using is the ChatGPT tools, which are available to us. And we're using them to do things like, it's quite an interesting one, I might just show you this better to see it. What we're doing there is in the HACCP module, for example, we are using AI to suggest food safety hazards that we might not have thought about. If I just pick this as a random example. Here, actually, this is a quite good example. This particular one, we've got products, sausages and burgers. Those have got materials in there which have got risk assessments done. And in the hazards area, this particular risk assessment, we can see all the raw material risks that are associated with that particular set of products. And I can now add those on into here as things that need to be considered as part of our process. So how are we going to manage that? How are we going to mitigate that? And then down here, we've got our AI. This is using ChatGPT. So I've got a list of data points already in the system for this particular type of process step. which are curated by AI already. And then over here, I can come there and I can say, go get me hazards for ingredient storage related to physical. This is literally using ChatGPT, and we've now extended that throughout the entire HACCP module to look for control measures, critical limits, corrective actions, validation, verification, because some of these things, they're not always obvious when you're running through a food safety plan. And of course, the point of the food safety plan is to consider everything, document it all, and so on. So here, for example, ChatGPT has come up with different things that could happen here, which are all fairly obvious, but there might be some not so obvious ones that come up there as well, depending on what you tell it to look for. The way that we use AI is really tightly controlled by both having the individual pieces of AI siloed, we spoke about silos earlier, but also by giving the user the choice as to whether they want to use something in the system or put their own information in there. And in doing so, we're then able to continue to build that neural network map. So it's a combination of humans and AI. Hope that answers the question.
Okay, thank you. Next question. How do you ensure data security with the use of AI?
Well, it's a very interesting question. Our point of view, it depends on what level you're asking that question at, but from a data security perspective, we actually have a centralized neural network map, which is what feeds everyone in terms of the hazards. Those hazards and controls and everything else, they're all related to particular types of process steps. But we just call them operation types, actually, because it could be a step in the supply chain or even at the consumer end. What we do is everything gets associated with an operation type, but how we're going to further develop this is we're going to start feeding in product types, raw material types, and so on as well to make it smarter about how it's going to help and assist. ChatGPT, for example, is what I call the sum of all human knowledge up until September 2021, which is quite a lot of human knowledge. Human knowledge available on the internet that has been able to learn from. That's really what ChatGPT is. What we're doing is we are gathering together the sum of all human knowledge to do with food safety, raw material risks and hazards and these kind of things, and bringing that into the system. And we'll be doing more on this. But in terms of security, how we do things is we isolate the AI pieces, we have a common database, and we also are planning on creating more AI tools, which again are isolated, which will curate the quality of that data as well. Because as you can imagine, with time, there's going to be more and more data in the system, and we don't want to be showing all of that data to everyone. So we need AI to look at that data and say, hey, you know what, that's same hazard has been described 25 different ways by different people. So we're not going to send 25. We'll give you 3 to choose from. That kind of thing. Aside from that, the rest of the security aspects are really down to in-house security. So right now we've got a Cyber Essentials Plus project ongoing to make sure that all of our systems and platforms are really hardened up to the kind of cyber threat that is growing in the world as well. So I don't know if that answers your question, but hopefully it gives you some indicators.
Yeah, thank you. Another couple have come in as well. Do you get alerts when an item gets flagged on Horizon Scan or other platforms?
In our solution, we have a module called AI Scan itself, and this focuses on 3 different things. It focuses on your suppliers. So this is looking at individual suppliers, and it also focuses on the global food alert data, which is going on out there. So, for example, these are RACIF data sources in this particular example here. And what you can do here is you can set up whatever alerts you want. So here's peanut butter and salmonella ones as a test here from Canada, RACIF. You could add in FDA here, FSA, FSAI, and Australia and New Zealand as well. And that would give me actual alerts that come through. But we are also already gathering all of the data from these, and we're using that to initiate the population of our hazard neural network map. So that's the one point. Horizon Scan from Fera does have an API, so we can go and look up the data in Horizon Scan and send alerts on that very basis and put them in here, in fact, and you can search all of those. The other part of that is the AI Scan on the supplier side. This is much more focused on who your individual suppliers are and whether they've had any safety issues, allergen issues, expired certification. So again, it's a blended approach. Not all of it's AI, Some of it's just looking up a data source and saying, hey, that certificate's expired or whatever. But other parts of it are down to looking at how many regulatory issues a particular company's had, how many safety issues they've had in the last 5 years. And all of that, again, is good data that you can feed into your risk assessments. And down the road, we'll be making stronger connections with those. Final tool out of the AI side is this anomaly detection tool, which is designed to look at the data points and look specifically for what we call anomalies. So these big yellow bars here are individual anomalies. So they're things that are unusual, which have happened. Whereas down here, this is the count of food alerts for whatever data source we happen to be looking at. So you can zoom out of this and look for things like this here. I use this example a lot because it's very clear there's something unusual going on here, and you can home in on that, go look at the data, and then drill into that. So it's another example of how this AI curated data can help us, because all of this data, the anomaly score that we employ here, is all based on the data that's coming via the AI analysis of that, identifying keywords and all of these things. So hopefully that gives you a bit of an idea. What we're trying to do is to take the work out of things so that you have got tools that automate rather than tools that you have to go and look at every day and try and understand what's going on. Okay, any other questions?
Yes, please. Next to a link, are all the risks stroke tools preset, or is there some more work involved? And what is the estimated time for a rollout for the program?
Everything's configurable is the short answer. To give you an idea, I actually set up a brand new system, and of course that's me. I know the system inside out, but I set up a brand new system for the US produce market last week in about 8 hours in total from scratch. So that's setting up the risk matrices. Actually worth having a look at that, because that's quite a good question to show a real life setting. I'll just show you this. So if I go to us.3iverify.com, because there will be some US people on the call here today. So we do, part of our business is it's called Global Import Agent. We do a lot of risk assessments for companies that want to import products into the US, food products. And in this particular case, I'm logged in with a default site here. Just to show you how this was set up, I set up these risk assessments in here for the produce industry. The risk assessments themselves probably took about an hour or two to actually set up and configure. And then it took me another 5 hours to actually do the risk assessment, the AI generated risk assessment for all of the categories of products which are in this grid here. This is a US one. It's going to be a little slow from where I am. So this is a fully completed, what's called an FSVP risk assessment. And you'll see here that we're not using all of the risks. So you can switch on and off the ones that you want to use and don't want to use. You can have different weighting factors and all that side of things. But I had some criteria I needed to put into this risk assessment. I had some 4, 5, 6 risk assessment matrices to set up, and then I've got my management outcome. So in this particular case, to manage this risk better, each of these risk assessments has got a series of things that need to be done, including gathering documentation and verifying water quality and all of these things. And they're all managed straight out of here. Risk assessment's done. You can see it's different criteria in here. And the way to reduce the risk with this supplier is look at everything that's flagging up and say, well, we don't have any documented evidence of irrigation water, so let's go get that. If we can get that, we answer this question, it reduces the risk. We can then re-risk assess the supplier and bring them more into line. And then we've got our renewals and reviews. So this is a very practical example of that. And this took the whole thing, covering a whole range of different products, took about a day to get it done.
Perfect. Okay, I think that's all of the questions today.
If any of you are interested in finding out more and having a deeper look, please do get in touch with us. We will send out a recording of this for everyone who did register. And I would like to thank you all very much for your time and interest and coming along today. You can either contact me on jf@primority.com, or you can email Sue on ss@primority.com. Once again, thank you very much for your time. I hope that's been useful for you. Thank you.